On the morning of April 8, 1968, a Soviet Golf-class submarine designated K-129 failed to transmit its scheduled communication to the Pacific Fleet Command in Vladivostok. The silence lasted 4 minutes, then 4 hours, then 4 days. By the time the Soviet Navy admitted internally that something had gone catastrophically wrong, K-129 had already become a tomb 3 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, carrying with it 98 men and 3 nuclear warheads that would never see daylight again. Or so the Soviets believed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the United States had heard everything. Every groan of metal, every moment of the submarine's final descent into the abyss. The Americans had listening stations hidden beneath the ocean floor, technological marvels that could detect a wrench dropping in a submarine halfway across the Pacific. They called it SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System, and it had just recorded what sounded like an implosion, a metallic scream, and then the slow, dying echo of something heavy settling into sediment 2,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Soviets had lost a nuclear weapon, and the Americans knew exactly where it was. This is not a story about heroism. This is not a story about victory or ideology or the triumph of freedom over tyranny. This is a story about a lie that both sides agreed to keep, about a machine built in secret to steal a submarine from the ocean floor, and about the men who went to their graves believing their deaths would remain unexplained forever. It begins not with an explosion, but with a slow, invisible failure. In the spring of 1968, the Cold War had entered what historians would later call its most dangerous phase, a period of false stability, where both superpowers had accumulated enough nuclear weapons to annihilate each other several times over, yet continued to build more, as if redundancy could somehow guarantee survival. The doctrine was called mutually assured destruction, and its logic was as simple as it was horrifying. Neither side could launch a first strike without guaranteeing their own annihilation in response. Peace was maintained not through diplomacy, but through the promise of total extinction. Submarines had become the most critical component of this delicate nightmare. Unlike missile silos, which could be targeted and destroyed in a first strike, submarines could hide beneath the ocean, invisible and invulnerable, carrying enough nuclear firepower to erase entire nations. They were the ultimate retaliatory weapon, silent, patient, and impossible to neutralize. The Soviet Union operated dozens of these vessels, patrolling the dark waters of the Atlantic and Pacific, their crews living in cramped, diesel-stained compartments for months at a time, breathing recycled air and drinking distilled seawater, all while carrying weapons capable of ending human civilization. K-129 was one of them. She was not a strategic ballistic missile submarine, those giants that carried 16 intercontinental missiles and operated like underwater fortresses. K-129 belonged to an older class, the Gulf II type, diesel-electric boats designed in the 1950s, when submarine technology was still crude and dangerous. She carried only 3 ballistic missiles, each topped with a 1-megaton nuclear warhead. Her job was not to hide in the deep ocean and wait for Armageddon, but to patrol closer to enemy shores, ready to strike quickly if war began. It was a suicide mission dressed up as duty. The submarine was based out of Rybachi Naval Base on the Kamchatka Peninsula, a frozen, wind-scarred stretch of eastern Siberia where winter lasted 9 months and the summer was simply a rumor. The base was isolated, surrounded by volcanic tundra and forests of stunted larch trees, a place where the Soviet state could conduct its most secret operations far from the eyes of Western intelligence. K-129's crew consisted of 98 men. Most of them were young, conscripts in their early 20s, who had been plucked from farms and factory towns across the Soviet Union and trained in the basics of submarine operation. They were taught how to operate diesel engines in confined spaces, how to load torpedoes, how to survive in a steel tube submerged beneath millions of tons of water. But they were not taught how to question orders, or why their government asked them to carry weapons that could kill millions of people who had never done them any harm. The officers were older, products of the Soviet Naval Academy system, men who had spent years studying the technical specifications of American destroyers and the geography of enemy coastlines. They knew the risks. They understood that diesel-electric submarines like K-129 were obsolete compared to the new nuclear-powered vessels the Americans were building. But the Soviet Union was still catching up, still trying to match the industrial might of the West with willpower and secrecy. Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzar commanded K-129. He was 43 years old, a career officer who had joined the Navy in 1945, just as the war against Nazi Germany was ending. He had served on surface ships during the late Stalinist years, a period when paranoia was the defining feature of Soviet military life, when a single wrong word could result in a transfer to a labor camp in Kolyma or a bullet in a basement in Lubyanka. Kobzar had learned early how to survive in that world, say nothing unnecessary, follow orders without question, and never ever express doubt about the righteousness of the Soviet cause. By the time he took command of K-129, he had become what the system required, a competent, silent man who understood that his duty was not to think, but to obey. His executive officer was Captain Second Rank Alexander Zhuravin, a younger man with a wife and 2 children back in Vladivostok. Zhuravin had joined the Navy in the late 1950s during Khrushchev's thaw, a brief period when it seemed the Soviet Union might soften its grip, might allow a little more freedom, a little more honesty. But the thaw had ended with Brezhnev's rise to power, and the old rules had returned. Loyalty above truth, silence above dissent. Zhuravin kept a photograph of his daughters in his cabin, tucked inside a copy of The Quiet Dawn, the only personal item he allowed himself. He rarely looked at it. The rest of the crew were names on a roster, faces in a lineup. Men whose lives were recorded in service files kept in fireproof cabinets in Moscow. Some were mechanics, others were radio operators or sonar technicians. A few were political officers, Zampolits, whose job was not to operate the submarine, but to watch the other men, to listen for signs of defeatism or disloyalty, to ensure that no one questioned why they were being sent into the Pacific with weapons that could incinerate cities. None of them knew they were about to die. K-129 departed Raibachi on February 24, 1968, slipping beneath the gray waves of the Bering Sea just after midnight. The mission was routine, a 70-day patrol in the North Pacific, maintaining a position within striking range of American naval installations in Hawaii and along the West Coast. The submarine would spend most of that time submerged, surfacing only briefly to recharge batteries and receive encrypted radio transmissions from Fleet Command. For the first 6 weeks, everything proceeded according to protocol. The crew settled into the monotonous rhythm of submarine life. 6-hour watch shifts, meals of canned fish and black bread, the constant hum of diesel engines and the metallic tang of oil and sweat in the recycled air. The submarine's interior was a maze of pipes, valves, and electrical conduits, every surface painted an institutional gray-green, the kind of color that seemed designed to suppress hope. At night, though night had no real meaning in a submarine where daylight never penetrated, the off-duty crew would play cards or read dog-eared copies of Soviet propaganda magazines, publications with names like Soviet Sailor and Red Star, filled with optimistic articles about industrial production quotas and the inevitable triumph of socialism. No one believed any of it, but no one said so aloud. Captain Kobzar spent most of his time in the control room, monitoring depth gauges and navigation charts, occasionally retreating to his cabin to review classified orders that arrived in code via radio transmissions. The orders never changed. Maintain patrol sector, avoid detection, remain ready to launch if the Americans struck first. The submarine carried enough diesel fuel to remain at sea for 70 days, but only enough fresh water for 60. The crew had learned to ration carefully, to wash only when absolutely necessary, to accept that thirst and discomfort were simply part of the job. By late March, K-129 had been at sea for 5 weeks. The crew was tired, irritable, and beginning to feel the psychological strain that came with prolonged isolation. Submariners called it the pressure. Not the physical pressure of the ocean, but the mental weight of living in a confined space with no privacy, no sunlight, no escape. Men began to snap at each other over minor infractions. A mechanic was reprimanded for falling asleep on watch. A cook was reported to the political officer for making a joke about Brezhnev's eyebrows. But the submarine continued to function. On April 4th, K-129 surfaced briefly to recharge her batteries and receive a radio transmission from Pacific Fleet Command. The message was encrypted, decoded by the communications officer using a one-time pad cipher, and delivered to Captain Kobzar in a sealed envelope. No one knows what the message said. The communications officer was instructed to burn the decryption pad immediately after use, a standard security protocol. Whatever orders Kobzar received, he kept them to himself. The submarine submerged again and continued its patrol. 4 days later, at 03:12 hours on April 8th, something went wrong. The explosion was not nuclear. If it had been, the entire submarine would have vaporized in an instant, leaving nothing but a brief flash of light beneath the surface and a radioactive plume that would have been detected by American monitoring stations within hours. Instead, what happened was slower, more agonizing. Somewhere deep inside K-129, in the aft section near the diesel engines, or possibly in the battery compartment, a fire started. It might have been an electrical short, or a fuel leak, or a battery cell that overheated and began to vent hydrogen gas. Diesel-electric submarines were floating tinderboxes, filled with flammable fuel, volatile batteries, and oxygen-rich air pumped through poorly ventilated compartments. Once a fire started, it spread quickly. The crew would have smelled it first, acrid smoke, chemical and choking, creeping through the ventilation system. Alarm bells would have sounded. Men would have grabbed fire extinguishers and breathing masks, stumbling through narrow passageways toward the source of the blaze, their movements clumsy in the confined space. But fires underwater are different from fires on land. There is no escape, no way to open a door and let the smoke out. The fire consumes the oxygen inside the submarine, replacing it with carbon monoxide and toxic fumes, and the crew begins to suffocate even as they fight the flames. The battery compartment was likely the worst place for a fire to start. Soviet submarines used lead-acid batteries to power the electric motors when submerged, massive arrays of cells stacked in compartments beneath the crew quarters. When these batteries overheated, they released hydrogen gas, colorless, odorless, and highly explosive. If a spark ignited the gas, the resulting explosion could blow through bulkheads, rupture fuel lines, and compromise the pressure hull. That is probably what happened to K-129. The fire started, the crew tried to contain it, and then the hydrogen ignited. The explosion would have been deafening in the enclosed space. A sharp metallic bang followed by the shriek of tearing steel. Bulkheads buckled, pipes burst. Seawater began to flood into the compartments through ruptured seams in the hull. The submarine's internal communication system failed. The crew in the forward section would have had no idea what was happening in the aft section, only that the submarine was suddenly tilting nose down, that the lights were flickering, that water was rising in the bilges. Captain Kobzar would have ordered an emergency surface, but the diesel engines were already failing, choked by smoke and flooded with seawater. The electric motors, powered by the dying batteries, could not generate enough thrust to bring the submarine back to the surface. K-129 began to sink. It would have taken minutes, not seconds. The men in the forward compartments would have felt the pressure increasing, their ears popping as the submarine descended past its crush depth. The hull would have groaned, a deep resonant sound like a church bell tolling underwater. And then, at some point, probably around 2,000 feet below the surface, the pressure hull failed. The ocean doesn't crush a submarine gently. It doesn't squeeze slowly like a hand closing around an egg. When a pressure hull fails, it collapses inward with catastrophic speed, the bulkheads imploding in a fraction of a second. The air inside compressed and superheated to thousands of degrees. The men inside would not have known what hit them. One moment they were standing in a steel corridor, trying to close watertight doors or pump water out of flooded compartments, and the next moment they were simply gone, their bodies obliterated by the same laws of physics that kept the ocean pressing down on everything beneath its surface. K-129 fell the rest of the way to the bottom in silence, tumbling slowly through the darkness, shedding debris as it descended, pieces of hull plating, fragments of equipment, the personal belongings of 98 men who would never return home. The submarine came to rest on a flat expanse of ocean floor, 16,500 feet below the surface, in a region of the Pacific where the water temperature was just above freezing and the pressure was nearly 5 tons per square inch. The nuclear warheads, still intact inside their missile tubes, settled into the sediment, and the Soviet Union had no idea where they were. In Moscow, in the windowless offices of the Soviet Navy's main staff, the disappearance of K-129 triggered a quiet panic. The submarine had missed its scheduled radio check-in on April 8th. This was not unusual. Radio communications with submerged submarines were unreliable, and brief lapses in contact were common. But when 24 hours passed with no transmission, the duty officer began to worry. By April 10th, Pacific Fleet Command had issued an alert to all Soviet naval units in the region. K-129 was overdue and presumed missing. Search operations began immediately. The Soviet Navy dispatched surface ships and aircraft to comb the North Pacific, focusing on K-129's last known patrol sector. But the ocean is vast, and a submarine, even a wrecked one, is nearly impossible to find without precise coordinates. The search vessels crisscrossed the same stretches of empty water day after day, scanning the surface for debris, for oil slicks, for any sign that K-129 had surfaced and then sunk. They found nothing. The truth was that the Soviet Navy had no reliable way to track its own submarines once they submerged. Unlike the Americans, who had developed sophisticated sonar networks and satellite surveillance systems, the Soviets relied on scheduled radio transmissions and dead reckoning. If a submarine failed to report its position, the Navy simply had to guess where it might be. K-129 could have been anywhere in a search area the size of Western Europe. By late April, the Soviet Navy had quietly accepted that the submarine was lost, though the official cause remained classified as unknown. Internally, naval intelligence officers speculated about possible causes: collision with an American submarine, mechanical failure, sabotage by a disloyal crew member, or even a mutiny. The families of the crew were notified in the usual way: brief, formal letters delivered by naval officers in dress uniforms, expressing regret and offering condolences on behalf of the Soviet state. The letters did not say where the submarine had sunk or why. They did not mention the nuclear warheads, and they certainly did not mention that the United States had been listening. At the headquarters of the Naval Ocean Surveillance Center in Dam Neck, Virginia, a team of analysts had been reviewing acoustic data recorded by the SOSUS network on the morning of April 8th. SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System, was one of the most classified programs in the U.S. Military, a network of underwater hydrophones strung along the ocean floor from Greenland to Norway to Japan, designed to detect Soviet submarines moving through the world's oceans. The system was so sensitive it could pick up the sound of a whale's heartbeat or the faint hum of a submarine's propeller shaft from hundreds of miles away. On April 8th, at 03:12 hours, a hydrophone array stationed near Midway Island had recorded an anomaly. It wasn't the sound of a propeller or a torpedo launch. It was something else, a sharp, percussive noise, followed by a long, low-frequency rumble that lasted nearly a minute. The analysts played the recording over and over, comparing it to known acoustic signatures in their classified database. The conclusion was unmistakable. They had just heard a submarine imploding. The location was triangulated using data from multiple hydrophone stations, and within 48 hours, the U.S. Navy had a fix on the wreck site, approximately 1,160 miles northwest of Hawaii in international waters. But the question remained, whose submarine? The Soviet Navy had not announced any losses, but that wasn't surprising. The Soviets rarely admitted to accidents, especially ones involving nuclear weapons. The Americans began reviewing intelligence reports, looking for any indication that a Soviet submarine had gone missing. By mid-April, they had their answer. Signals intelligence intercepted from Soviet naval communications indicated that K-129 was overdue. Satellite imagery showed increased activity at Soviet naval bases in the Pacific. Search aircraft taking off, surface ships being deployed in unusual patterns. The Americans knew the Soviets had lost a submarine, and they knew exactly where it was. What happened next would become one of the most audacious and expensive covert operations in the history of the Cold War. A mission so secret that its true purpose would not be revealed for nearly 30 years. The CIA called it Project Azorian, and it began with a single, deceptively simple question. Could the United States steal a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean? The idea seemed absurd. K-129 lay 3 miles beneath the surface, in water so deep that sunlight had never touched it. The pressure at that depth would crush a human body instantly. No diver could reach it. No conventional salvage ship could lift it. Even if it were possible to reach the wreck, how would the Americans extract it without the Soviets noticing? But the potential intelligence value was too enormous to ignore. A Soviet submarine, especially one carrying nuclear warheads, was a treasure trove of classified information. The Americans could study the submarine's propulsion systems, its sonar equipment, its cryptographic machines. They could examine the nuclear warheads and learn how Soviet weapons designers had solved the technical challenges of miniaturization and yield optimization. They might even recover documents, code books, or intelligence files that could reveal Soviet naval strategy. And there was another, darker possibility. If K-129 had sunk because of a collision with an American submarine, something the U.S. Navy had quietly been doing for years as part of a classified program to track Soviet vessels, then recovering the wreck might reveal evidence that could be embarrassing or worse, used by the Soviets to justify military escalation. Either way, the Americans wanted that submarine. In the summer of 1968, the CIA convened a secret task force to study the feasibility of a deep ocean salvage operation. The team included naval engineers, oceanographers, and intelligence analysts, all working under the cover of a fictional marine research project. The technical challenges were staggering. No ship in the world had ever attempted to lift an object weighing 2,000 tons from a depth of 16,500 feet. The salvage vessel would need a crane powerful enough to haul the submarine vertically through 3 miles of water, a feat of engineering that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But the CIA had a solution. They would build a ship specifically for this mission, a vessel disguised as a civilian deep-sea mining platform, equipped with a massive claw-like device capable of grabbing the submarine and lifting it into a hidden compartment inside the ship's hull. The ship would be called the Hughes Glomar Explorer, and it would be the largest covert operation in CIA history. Construction began in 1970, funded through a maze of front companies and shell corporations designed to obscure the true purpose of the project. The official cover story was that the ship was being built for Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire, to conduct deep-sea mining operations for manganese nodules, mineral deposits that littered the ocean floor and were, in theory, valuable enough to justify a massive investment. The story was plausible enough that even some of the engineers working on the ship believed it, but the truth was far stranger. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was a ship that should not have existed. She was 619 feet long, with a displacement of 63,000 tons fully loaded, making her one of the largest vessels ever built for a single specific purpose. Her most distinctive feature was a massive opening in her center, a moon pool that ran from the main deck down through the bottom of the hull, allowing objects to be lifted directly into the ship's interior, hidden from satellites and surveillance aircraft. Suspended above this opening was a crane system capable of lowering a giant mechanical claw, officially called the capture vehicle, to the ocean floor. The claw was designed with articulated fingers that could wrap around K-129's hull and grip it securely enough to withstand the tremendous forces involved in lifting a 2,000-ton submarine through 3 miles of water. The engineering was unprecedented. Every component had to be designed to function at depths where the pressure could crush steel like aluminum foil. The cables had to be strong enough to support the submarine's weight without snapping, yet flexible enough to spool onto massive drums inside the ship. Hydraulic systems had to operate in near-freezing water. Navigation systems had to position the ship precisely over the wreck site, maintaining station in the open ocean despite wind, waves, and currents. And all of this had to be done in complete secrecy. The CIA created an elaborate cover identity for the mission. They leaked stories to the press about Howard Hughes's interest in deep-sea mining, planted articles in industry magazines about the economic potential of manganese nodules, and even hired legitimate mining engineers to give lectures at technical conferences, lending credibility to the deception. The KGB was watching, of course. Soviet intelligence had noticed the construction of the Glomar Explorer and had filed reports speculating about its true purpose. But the cover story was so thoroughly constructed, so detailed and plausible, that most KGB analysts concluded it was exactly what it appeared to be: an eccentric American billionaire's expensive experiment in ocean mining. By 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was ready. The ship departed from Long Beach, California, on June 20, 1974, ostensibly headed for a mining site in the Central Pacific. On board were 178 crew members, most of whom believed they were participating in a legitimate deep-sea mining operation. Only a handful of CIA officers and senior engineers knew the real mission. The Glomar sailed northwest, transmitting routine position reports and weather observations, maintaining the appearance of a commercial operation. Soviet spy satellites photographed the ship as it crossed the Pacific, but saw nothing unusual, just a large mining vessel going about its business. On July 4, 1974, deliberately chosen to coincide with American Independence Day, when Soviet intelligence analysts might be distracted, the Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived at the coordinates where K-129 lay on the ocean floor. The ship lowered anchors and began dynamic positioning, using computer-controlled thrusters to hold station over the wreck site despite the ocean's constant motion. And then the real work began. The first challenge was finding the exact position of the submarine. The SOSUS network had provided coordinates accurate to within a few miles, but that was not precise enough. The capture vehicle needed to descend directly onto the wreck, and missing by even 100 yards would mean failure. The Glomar deployed a deep-sea sonar system, sending acoustic pulses down through the water and analyzing the returning echoes. Slowly, over the course of several days, a picture emerged. A long cylindrical object lying on the seabed, partially buried in sediment, clearly artificial. It was K-129. The submarine had broken into several pieces during the descent or upon impact with the ocean floor. The bow section had separated from the rest of the hull, and the conning tower, the submarine's command center, had collapsed. But the main hull, including the missile compartment with its 3 nuclear warheads, appeared to be relatively intact. On July 8th, the CIA gave the order to proceed with the recovery. The capture vehicle was lowered into the moon pool, a massive assembly of steel beams and hydraulic actuators that looked like something designed for a science fiction film. Inch by inch, it descended into the darkness, the cables paying out from enormous spools with a sound like distant thunder. It took 12 hours for the capture vehicle to reach the ocean floor. At that depth, there was no light except the faint glow from the vehicle's floodlights, which illuminated a barren landscape of gray sediment and manganese nodules. The water was so clear that visibility extended for hundreds of feet in all directions, revealing a world that looked more like the surface of an alien planet than anything on Earth. The Glomar's crew, watching through remotely operated cameras, could see K-129 lying on the bottom like a dead whale. The submarine's hull was covered in rust and marine growth, encrusted with tiny organisms that had colonized the wreck in the 6 years since it sank. The Soviet naval insignia, once painted in bright red on the conning tower, had faded to a dull brown. Debris was scattered around the wreck, pieces of equipment, fragments of hull plating, and objects that might have been personal belongings of the crew. It was a graveyard. The capture vehicle maneuvered slowly into position, its mechanical fingers extending like the legs of a giant spider. Hydraulic actuators whined as the claw opened, positioning itself over the submarine's hull. And then, very carefully, it began to close. The first attempt failed. One of the claw's fingers failed to grip properly, sliding off the submarine's hull and gouging a furrow in the sediment. The engineers surfaced the capture vehicle, spent 2 days recalibrating the hydraulic systems, and tried again. The second attempt was successful. The claw closed around K-129's hull with a grinding metallic screech that was audible even through 3 miles of water. Sensors confirmed that all fingers had locked into place. The submarine was secure. On July 20, 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer began the long, agonizing process of lifting K-129 from the ocean floor. The lift took nearly a week. The cables could only be reeled in slowly, a few feet per minute, to avoid overstressing the system. Any sudden movement could cause the submarine to break apart or slip from the claw's grasp, sending it tumbling back to the ocean floor and destroying 6 years of planning. Inside the Glomar's control room, engineers monitored hundreds of sensors: cable tension, hydraulic pressure, ship stability, weather conditions. Outside, Soviet intelligence vessels had begun to appear on the horizon, their radar systems sweeping the area, their cameras photographing the Glomar from a distance. The KGB had finally figured out what was happening. Soviet naval intelligence had received reports from merchant ships in the area describing unusual activity around the Glomar, lights visible at night, the sound of heavy machinery operating continuously, the ship remaining stationary for days in open ocean. A Soviet destroyer had been dispatched to investigate, along with a signals intelligence vessel equipped to intercept radio communications. The Americans knew they were being watched. CIA officers aboard the Glomar sent false radio messages describing mining operations, deployed equipment on the surface that looked like ore processing machinery, and even staged a fake equipment failure to explain why the ship remained in one location for so long. But they couldn't stop the lift. K-129 was rising through the water, slowly ascending through the darkness, pulled upward by cables thicker than a man's thigh. The submarine's hull groaned under the strain, metal plates flexing and buckling as the pressure decreased. Rivets that had held for decades in the stable environment of the deep ocean began to fail as the submarine moved through layers of water with different temperatures and pressures. On July 25th, when K-129 was approximately 5,000 feet below the surface, disaster struck. One of the claw's mechanical fingers failed catastrophically, the hydraulic actuator rupturing under the immense load. The finger opened, and K-129 began to slip. Engineers frantically tried to compensate, increasing hydraulic pressure to the remaining fingers, but the damage was done. The submarine's hull, weakened by years of corrosion and the stress of the lift, began to break apart. The aft section, the portion containing the diesel engines, the crew quarters, and an unknown number of bodies, tore free and fell back toward the ocean floor, tumbling through the darkness and disappearing from the camera's view. What remained in the claw was approximately one-third of the submarine, the forward section, including the bow, the torpedo room, and, most importantly, at least one of the nuclear warheads. The CIA made a decision in real time: continue the lift and recover whatever remained, or abort and lose everything. They chose to continue. On August 1st, 1974, what was left of K-129 was pulled into the moon pool of the Hughes Glomar Explorer and sealed inside the ship's hidden compartment, away from the cameras of the circling Soviet vessels. The United States had just stolen a Soviet submarine. The recovery operation remained classified for years. The CIA maintained the cover story, insisting that the Glomar Explorer was simply a mining vessel and that the entire mission had been a commercial failure. No valuable minerals recovered, just expensive equipment failures and wasted time. But inside the Glomar's sealed compartment, intelligence analysts were already at work. They photographed every inch of the recovered section, cataloging equipment, analyzing metal composition, studying weld patterns and construction techniques. They found torpedoes still loaded in their tubes, cryptographic equipment, navigation charts marked with patrol routes, and code books, some partially destroyed by seawater, others still legible, and they found bodies. 6 Soviet sailors were recovered from the wreckage, their remains preserved by the cold water and lack of oxygen at depth. The CIA, in a gesture that was part intelligence operation and part unexpected decency, gave them a proper burial at sea, filmed on classified video with a Soviet naval ensign draped over each body bag, while an officer read a prepared statement in Russian. "We commit the bodies of these 6 Soviet seamen to the deep," the officer said, his words recorded for a file that would remain secret for decades. They served their country with honor and courage. The film was intended as evidence, proof that the Americans had treated the dead with respect, something that could be shown to Soviet officials if the operation was ever discovered. But the Soviets never asked. The nuclear warhead recovered from K-129 was transported under heavy guard to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, where weapons designers spent months disassembling it, studying its trigger mechanisms, analyzing its plutonium core, measuring the precision of its components. What they learned remains classified to this day. The intelligence value of the operation was immense, but so was the cost. Project Azorian had consumed nearly $800 million, equivalent to more than $4 billion in today's currency, making it one of the most expensive covert operations in CIA history. And the Soviets, though they suspected something had happened, never conclusively proved that the Americans had recovered their submarine. The KGB filed reports. Naval intelligence analysts wrote assessments. But without hard evidence, the Soviet government chose not to press the issue, perhaps because acknowledging the truth would require admitting that they had lost a nuclear-armed submarine and didn't know where it had gone. The Cold War had a way of burying its own secrets. In Vladivostok, in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, Juravin's wife received her husband's death certificate in the mail. It arrived in a plain brown envelope, stamped with the seal of the Pacific Fleet Command, no return address. The certificate listed the date of death as April 8, 1968, the cause as lost at sea during performance of military duties. There was no mention of where, or how, or why. She kept the certificate in a wooden box, along with her husband's Naval Academy graduation photo, his last letter home, and a small medal the government had sent, a posthumous award for service to the Soviet state, given to all 98 men who had died aboard K-129. For years, she and the other families asked questions. Where had the submarine sunk? Had the crew suffered? Was there any hope that some of them had survived, trapped in an air pocket, waiting for rescue that never came? The Soviet Navy gave no answers. Official policy was that the loss of K-129 was classified, that discussing the incident constituted a breach of state security, that the families should accept their loss with dignity and not cause trouble for the government that had sent their husbands and sons to die in a submarine that was too old, too dangerous, and too poorly maintained to be at sea. Jurovin's wife never remarried. She died in 1993, 2 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, still not knowing where her husband was buried. The wooden box with his photograph and medal was passed to her daughters, who kept it in an attic and rarely opened it, because the past was painful and there was no point in dwelling on questions that had no answers. Across the Soviet Union, in small towns and cities from Murmansk to Vladivostok, similar stories played out. Mothers who lit candles in Orthodox churches, praying for sons who had disappeared into the Pacific. Wives who kept their husbands' naval uniforms hanging in closets, unwilling to throw them away. Children who grew up knowing their fathers only through photographs and stories, wondering what kind of men they had been, what they had thought about in their final moments. The Soviet state offered no comfort, only silence. K-129 was never officially acknowledged. The families received no compensation beyond the standard death benefits given to all military personnel. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and archives began to open, journalists and historians searched for records of the submarine's loss, but most of the files had been destroyed or remained classified even in the new Russia. It was as if 98 men had simply vanished, their deaths erased from history. In the United States, Project Azorian remained classified until 1975, when investigative journalists began asking questions about the Hughes Glomar Explorer and its mysterious mission. The CIA neither confirmed nor denied the operation, invoking a legal principle that would later become famous, the Glomar response, a refusal to confirm or deny the existence of classified information. But pieces of the story leaked out over the years. In 1993, the CIA officially acknowledged Project Azorian, releasing a sanitized version of the mission's history that omitted most of the technical details and all of the intelligence findings. In 2010, declassified documents revealed that the operation had been more successful than previously admitted, that the Americans had recovered not just debris, but significant portions of the submarine, including at least one nuclear warhead and enough cryptographic material to compromise Soviet naval codes for years. The full story will probably never be known. Some files remain classified. Some participants in the operation signed non-disclosure agreements that will outlive them. And some truths are simply too embarrassing for either government to admit, like the fact that the Cold War was fought not just with missiles and spies, but with lies so elaborate that even the people telling them sometimes forgot what was real. Today, the wreckage of K-129 still lies on the ocean floor, 6,500 feet below the surface of the Pacific. The aft section that broke away during the recovery operation, the portion containing most of the crew's remains, settled back into the sediment and has been slowly consumed by the ocean, colonized by deep-sea organisms that know nothing of the Cold War or the men who died inside that steel tomb. The nuclear warheads that were not recovered remain there as well, sealed inside their launch tubes, their plutonium cores slowly decaying with a half-life measured in millennia. They are inert now, no longer capable of detonation, but their radioactivity will persist long after the last human being who remembers the Cold War has died. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Occasionally, when the wind and currents are right, fishing boats pass over the site. Their sonar equipment sometimes detects an anomaly on the ocean floor, a metallic mass that doesn't belong, but the captains note it on their charts and move on. It's probably just an old wreck, they think. The Pacific is full of them. They have no idea they're sailing over a graveyard. In Russia, the families of K-129's crew still gather once a year on April 8th to commemorate the anniversary of the submarine's loss. They meet in Vladivostok at a small memorial near the waterfront, a granite stone engraved with 98 names and the dates 1968. The memorial does not say where the men died or how. It simply reads, "They served their motherland with honor." Some of the families have tried over the years to learn the truth. They have filed petitions with the Russian government, requesting access to naval archives. They have contacted American journalists and historians, hoping someone might know what happened. Most have given up. The past, they have learned, is a locked room, and the Cold War threw away the key. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was eventually sold to a private contractor and converted into a legitimate deep-sea drilling platform. She operated for years in the oil and gas industry, drilling exploratory wells in the Gulf of Mexico and the North Sea. Her crew, unaware that the ship beneath their feet had once been used to steal a Soviet submarine. In 2015, the Glomar was decommissioned and sold for scrap. She was towed to a shipbreaking yard in China, where workers spent months cutting her apart, recycling the steel, dismantling the massive cranes and hydraulic systems that had once lifted K-129 from the ocean floor. The moon pool, the secret at the heart of the ship, was filled with concrete before the hull was cut into sections. No one wanted questions about why a mining vessel had such a strange design. By 2017, the Hughes Glomar Explorer no longer existed. Her steel recycled into rebar and sheet metal. Her story forgotten by everyone except a handful of retired CIA officers and naval engineers who still remembered when the impossible had seemed briefly within reach. There is a lesson in all of this, though it is not a comforting one. The Cold War was fought by ordinary people who believed they were serving something greater than themselves. Freedom, socialism, security, peace. They believed that their sacrifices mattered, that the secrets they kept and the lies they told were necessary to protect their countries from an enemy that wanted to destroy everything they loved. And perhaps some of that was true. But the story of K-129 reveals a different truth, that the Cold War was also a machine that consumed lives and buried them in silence, that treated men as expendable components in a system too vast to care about individual suffering. Captain Kobzar and his crew died believing that their mission was vital, that their deaths would be remembered, that the Soviet state would honor their sacrifice. Instead, they were erased. The CIA officers and engineers who planned Project Azorian believed they were recovering valuable intelligence, protecting American security, outsmarting the Soviet enemy. But they were also grave robbers, pulling bodies from the ocean floor and cataloging them like artifacts, filming funerals for men whose families would never know what had happened. Neither side was heroic. Neither side was evil. They were all just human beings trapped inside a system that demanded lies and rewarded silence, that turned tragedy into classified files and grief into state secrets. And the ocean, indifferent to ideology and immune to propaganda, simply covered everything in sediment and waited. If you find yourself thinking about K-129 and the 98 men who died in the darkness 3 miles below the Pacific, remember this. Their story is not unique. There are dozens of submarines lying on the ocean floor, American and Soviet, lost to accidents and fires and collisions that were never fully explained. There are thousands of men buried inside those steel tombs, their names recorded in classified files, their deaths mourned in private by families who were told to stay silent. The Cold War did not end because one side won. It ended because both sides realized eventually that they were destroying themselves from within, bankrupting their economies, traumatizing their populations, sacrificing their young to a conflict that had no purpose beyond its own continuation. But the scars remain. In Russia, where veterans of the Soviet Navy still gather to drink vodka and remember comrades who never came home. In the United States, where retired CIA officers still carry the weight of operations that required them to lie to everyone, even themselves. And on the ocean floor, where K-129 and submarines like her will remain for centuries, silent monuments to a war that was fought in shadows and ended with no victory, only exhaustion. The nuclear warheads are still there. The bodies are still there. The secrets are still there. And the ocean, patient and vast, keeps them all. On April 8, 2025, 57 years after K-129 sank, a small group of Russian veterans gathered at the memorial in Vladivostok. They were old now, these men, submariners who had served on boats like K-129, who had spent months at a time submerged in the darkness, breathing recycled air and listening to the groans of the pressure hull, wondering if today would be the day something went wrong. They placed flowers at the base of the granite memorial. They drank a toast to the 98 men whose names were carved in stone, and then they went home, because there was nothing else to do. Across the Pacific, in an archive in Virginia, a retired CIA officer sat in his study, looking at a photograph he had kept for decades, a classified image of K-129 lying on the ocean floor, illuminated by the lights of the capture vehicle. He had been part of Project Azorian, one of the engineers who had helped design the recovery system. He had watched through remote cameras as the claw closed around the submarine, had held his breath during the long, agonizing lift, had felt the sickening jolt when the hull broke apart and half the submarine fell back into the abyss. He was 91 years old now, and most of the men he had worked with were dead. The operation had been declassified years ago, but he still didn't talk about it. What was there to say? That they had stolen a submarine? That they had recovered bodies and buried them at sea? That the Cold War had been a nightmare from which everyone had finally woken, only to discover that the nightmare was real, and the bodies were still there? He closed the file and put it back in the drawer. Some secrets, he thought, should stay buried. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile the line between duty and tragedy really was, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Accounts of ordinary people caught in the machinery of superpowers. Tales of decisions made in silence that shaped the world we inherited. History is not just dates and battles. It is the sum of all the small, desperate choices made by people who believed they had no other option, who served systems that consumed them, who died believing their sacrifices mattered. K-129's crew believed they were protecting their homeland. The CIA officers believed they were protecting theirs. Both were right. Both were wrong. And the ocean, which knows nothing of nations or ideologies, simply accepted the dead and covered them with sediment, as it has done for millennia. The Cold War is over. But the submarines remain. And somewhere, 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific, in water so cold and dark that nothing moves except the slow drift of sediment, K-129 lies in silence. The nuclear warheads are corroding. The hull is collapsing. The names of 98 men are fading from memory. And the only witnesses are the creatures of the deep, blind, colorless things that drift through the darkness, unconcerned with the ambitions of surface dwellers, indifferent to the flags and ideologies that sent those men to their deaths. In 1,000 years, K-129 will be nothing but rust and fragments, indistinguishable from the geology of the ocean floor. The Cold War will be a footnote in history books, a curious period when humanity came close to destroying itself and then, somehow, stepped back. And the only evidence that it ever happened will be the faint radioactive signature of decayed plutonium, detectable only by instruments sensitive enough to measure the ghost of a weapon that was never fired. The ocean remembers. Even when we choose to forget.